Welcome back to my Star Wars Tales EU Canonicity series. We've made it to issue number 7, which was published in 2001. Features Boba Fett on the cover, and it says on the cover, featuring Boba Fett, Plo Koon, Yoda, Mace Windu, and Domo Jones, who's a character we will talk about shortly. If you've never seen this series before, I'd recommend watching the first 6 episodes. We're going through the Star Wars Tales comic book series, which goes for, I think, 22 or 24 issues. Something like that. And we're going to make it to the end eventually. I put one of these out every couple months or so. So we'll eventually get to the end of this comic book series in going through and discussing its canonicity. So we're on issue number 7 here. Now, how do we go about doing this? Leland Chee, who was the continuity master, the holocron keeper for Lucasfilm back in the day, had a couple of parameters that he used in trying to figure out which stories from Star Wars Tales are non-canon infinities and aren't a part of the story, and which ones are canon expanded universe material. Because there's a mix of both in these issues. Some of these stories that are in here, which there's typically 4 to 5 stories per issue, some of them are canon. Some of them are wacky and just don't fit. And so it's kind of hard sometimes. The lines are kind of blurred to try to figure out where these stories go. So stories that were referenced in other EU sources were considered canon. So if a story was referenced later in later expanded universe media, that was generally considered to be canon to the expanded universe. This would be elements like characters, planets, locations, technology appearing in later sources meant that the fact that it appeared later on in another source independently means that it probably pulls the story up and makes it part of the lore. Stories that were outrageous or comedic were typically considered non-canon, but there are exceptions. There's a gray area where it is sometimes not comedic, but it isn't referenced elsewhere. There's sometimes where it's comedic, but it is referenced elsewhere. So when it's comedic, but it's still referenced elsewhere, the reference usually overrules. Then there's another thing that kind of tethers it to the EU canon is when it references pre-existing EU lore. So if a story has a character that appeared in a prior EU book or comic, that means that it has a good chance of being in continuity. So with those rules out of the way, let's delve into the first story, which is called Single Cell. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is in the title sequence, Single Cell, and the names of the writers are like made to be graffiti on the wall of this prison cell, which I thought was a really nice touch, so I wanted to highlight that. Single Cell features Nim, who is an important character from the Starfighter video games. So this story is referenced elsewhere in the EU. It introduces a character who's this Chadra fan down here named Cole. And Cole, pictured there, is a Chadra fan. This is his first appearance in this short comic here in this Tales issue. But he is referenced elsewhere in the EU. He will go on to get a complete encyclopedia entry. He'll go on to appear in the Starfighter Crossbone comic books. And he will go on to appear in the Starfighter sequel video game, Jedi Starfighter. So this short comic that introduces this character is so important for introducing him because he goes on to be a major player later on in this area of Star Wars. This short comic references the EU. It includes the character Jenkins, who's a Bith, Nim, the Theorin, who is pictured under the word Single Cell, and Vana Sage. All 3 of those characters were featured in the Starfighter video game, and they appear in this short comic, which means that it's referenced pre-existing EU as well as being referenced for the original elements later on. It's not intended to be comedic or outrageous, so in my opinion, certified EU canon. I don't think it can be doubted. This story's a part of the timeline. Next, we have Nerf Herder, which is surprisingly referenced elsewhere in the EU, yet it's intended to be comedic. I don't think it's intended to be outrageous, though. It's definitely intended to be a comedic story. It's funny. It's a little bit ridiculous and credulous at parts, but I think that's by design. It's to show that this wacky story is going on. It takes place on Tatooine, like all Star Wars stories apparently do, and it is surprisingly referenced elsewhere in the EU. The protagonist of the story is a petty nerf herding farmer boy named Domo Jones. Domo Jones will go on to have an entry in the complete Star Wars encyclopedia, and Domo Jones also goes on to be mentioned in the Star Wars Galaxies MMO video game. So he appears later on. So this story is referenced in the EU. Mos Zabu, which is a city where this story takes place in the short comic, is referenced with an entry in the complete Star Wars encyclopedia. So, in my opinion, despite being comedic, this is a certified EU canon story because elements from the story are referenced later on in multiple sources. That elevates its canon status. So, while a little wacky, I think this story's part of the timeline. Next, we have Jedi Chef, which also goes by the name Pizza the Hut. This is a little bit weird, this story. The art is really wacky. It's definitely meant to be a parody of a reality cooking show in Star Wars, but it's referenced elsewhere in the EU. The Danusian Squirmers, which are this little delectable dish right here, are referenced in the Star Wars fact file. So the official Star Wars fact file references Denisian Squirmers from the planet Denisia, which the planet Denisia will go on to appear in the Essential Atlas by Jason Fry. That means that the weird little animals that they're cooking with in this short comic are definitely established to be in the lore. So that kind of elevates this because the Denisian Squirmers go on to appear later on. And they first appeared here. It references the EU. There's a pre-existing Jedi Council member named Micah Giat who appeared in a whole heap of Dark Horse comics. Jedi Council Acts of War and all of those comics he appears in. And he's even referenced in the Jedi Apprentice series. This features Micah Giat and Plo Koon as the main protagonists. Micah Giat being a protagonist is important because that's an EU-only character. So since this is referencing EU lore elements, that means it's a part of the lore. So although this is, though, intended to be comedic and outrageous, there is some silly stuff that happens in here. The main antagonist is a hut named Slobber Drool. So there is some wacky stuff here. But could a wacky Jedi mission have taken place? Yes, and it's referenced later on. It references the EU with Micah Giat appearing here. So my opinion is, in spite of it being comedic, this is certified EU canon. There's just story elements here that are referenced later on in later EU material. That pulls up its canonicity. Next up, we have the story Outbid But Never Outgunned. This is a special one because, as you'll notice, it doesn't say my opinion. It says Leland Chee said, certified EU canon. Leland Chee literally made a statement regarding this story's canonicity. This is referenced elsewhere in the EU, and it is not intended to be comedic or outrageous. Not only are characters, planets, species that were introduced in this story featured later on in the EU, but the entire story itself is referenced later on. Outbid But Never Outgunned first established Boba Fett's wife and the existence of his child and his love interest. And fans from the get-go were like, well, this can't be. How can this be within continuity? And fans were kind of upset right off the bat. But Abel G. Pena, and beside the picture I have of Abel G. Pena, I have a picture of the story itself. He wrote a Mandalorian-focused historical article that was featured in Star Wars Insider issue number 80, I believe, which is pictured there. And in that issue was this article about the Mandalorians, and it references that Cintas does exist. So it references the story, and it references elements of the story. The projector of his family would go on to appear in Blood Ties issue number 3, which is also pictured there. So future comics double down on the fact that this story existed. And then primarily Legacy of the Force tripled down on it by literally having so many elements of this comic mentioned and important and integral to Boba Fett's character and story as presented in those novels. This is one of the most important tale stories I think there is. It's not my favorite. It's not like a masterpiece or anything. It's really mediocre at best, but it's probably one of, if not the single most important story to come out of the Tales comic book series, just because of the impact the lore has on the character of Boba Fett. How could a small, like 10-page short comic influence the lore in this way? It's kind of crazy. And it's all thanks in part to Abel G. Pena for bringing that lore over to the short article that would then be taken and run within the Legacy of the Force books and in Blood Ties. Additionally, Leland Chee spoke out about it on the forums back in the day and literally said that is a part of the lore. Abel brought it into the lore. So this is a very interesting story case where it's not like we're using the parameters of the rules that Leland Chee set. They literally said that's kind of how important this story is. Lastly, we have Force Fiction, and this is a real headache. This one. It's kind of referenced elsewhere in the EU. Force Fiction features Yoda and Mace Windu eating during episode 1, like going out to eat lunch, and they're discussing like should Anakin be trained. Oddly, Mace Windu, who in the film was like against Anakin, is for Anakin's training in the story, and Yoda's against it. It's really weird. It's written by Kevin Rubio, who writes Tag and Bink and a lot of the like non-canon silly Dark Horse Star Wars stories. As you can see, though, this is giving me a headache because there's some wacky stuff here. I'm excited to talk about it, though. So in the story, Yoda, who is pictured here, wields a golden lightsaber, a yellow lightsaber that Yoda wields. What is going on here, right? But it is established in the lore that Yoda had multiple lightsabers. He has his standard green lightsaber. I think he had a blue lightsaber as well. And this yellow lightsaber he has too. Now, in the Dark Forces Saga Part 1 by Abel G. Pena and Jason Fry, which I took a screenshot of the article, it was for the Wizards of the Coast miniatures campaigns, it is referenced that Q-Ron, who I have pictured underneath Force Fiction, Q-Ron was given a yellow golden bladed lightsaber by Yoda. So, is this a reference to Force Fiction? Well, Abel G. Pena talks about that in this screenshot that I have in the bottom left regarding and revolving around this story. And Abel G. Pena mentions that the lightsaber that Yoda gave to Q-Ron is probably the same one that was shown in the Force Fiction short comic. Whoa. So, does that mean that Force Fiction is part of the EU? Well, the problem is it's also intended to be comedic and outrageous. And these problems get bigger if you look at the comics that the comic itself that I've taken screenshots from and pasted down on the right. So, as you can see, the Beatles are eating at the same establishment as Mace and Yoda. Buzz Lightyear and a robot from some old show are sitting at a table behind them, as well as George Lucas and Jar Jar Binks. So, they're all sitting at the table behind Yoda and Mace Windu. Mace's view doesn't really align with what he thinks in the movie. Palpatine interacts with Yoda and Mace Windu and encourages them to train Anakin, and it just like some of the story elements to it are a little weird. They've gone out for lunch and Mace Windu is like, give me a double, referring to the cheeseburger that he wants. It's just very odd. But the reason that I've put my opinion, I honestly don't know, is I'm of two completely different minds. I do not want a story that has Buzz Lightyear and George Lucas sitting behind Mace and Yoda eating on Coruscant to be a part of the lore. But this little connection here with Yoda's golden lightsaber being the one that's passed to Q-Ron via a different article that connects to the video games that's been proposed by Abel G. Pena is just masterful, beautiful, obscure continuity that I just love and adore so much. This is why I love Star Wars, because of all of these minute connections and details that all fit in together. But is that enough to make it EU canon? Like, I don't know. I've been very stressed thinking about this one as it happens. It is very, very, very confusing to say the least, um, in regards to, does this fit? Does this fit? Well, I don't know that it does. I don't know that it does because of this, because of these absurd things happening in the background, as well as Mace's like weird stance and stuff like that. So I honestly don't know, but I might veer towards EU canon just because I love that little connection that tethers it to the lore. I love that Abel G. Pena, he's a maximalist, so he wants to bring it all into the lore, all into the continuity. So did he do that here? Well, I kind of tend to think so. So while I honestly don't know, I'm going to make a decision on the fly and say, I guess canon? Maybe we can ignore the background elements and say that was artistic interpretation. Maybe so. It is very, very confusing though with this one because there's very much evidence for and against. But I'm gonna say it's EU canon with a very big asterisk that says Buzz Lightyear's in the background of this comic. Let me know in the comments what you guys think in regards to this story. This is one of the wackiest ones probably that we've covered so far. But believe me, there will be some wacky ones in the future Tales comic issues that I'm going to be covering. There's some absurd, insane stuff in these comics, and I can't wait to talk about it next time. But overall, it looks like all 5 of these stories are within the lore, within the continuity, with that big asterisk at the end. Let me know what stories you guys liked best out of this issue. Let me know what you guys think about the controversial last issue, Force Fiction. I didn't even talk about how it's a parody of Samuel L. Jackson's Pulp Fiction or anything like that, but that is another element and aspect to unpack in regards to that story. Absolutely wild stuff. So let me know in the comments where you fall in regards to what you consider for that story. It is absurd. But overall, I think everything's EU canon within this issue. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time when we cover issue 8. See you then.